Appeals to authority are central and important in our world. We may associate them particularly with fundamentalist religion, but we can find them in many other places. We can find them in politics and in everyday life. There may be extreme examples that we might think of, like those of Islamic fundamentalists, but we are all subject to appeals to authority to limited degrees at various times. The basic problem with appeals to authority is what's known as the genetic fallacy. This has nothing to do with genetics. It's basically the problem of appealing to the source of something in order to justify it. Now, the sources can tell us something about the justification to some degree of what it is we're considering, but it certainly doesn't tell us for sure that the thing we're looking at, the beliefs it offers us, are necessarily right or necessarily wrong. The genetic fallacy can apply to a person, or it can apply to a text just as much. After all, texts are written by people, at least generally speaking. The person and the text type of genetic fallacy can just as easily be used when assuming that it must be right because of its origin, because it comes from a certain authoritative person, or it comes from the Quran, or it comes from the IKEA instruction manual, or whatever it is. Or on the other hand, that it must be wrong because a certain politician you dislike has said it, for example, or because it comes from some book that you judge to be wrong. So the genetic fallacy is the widest way of describing the appeals to authority. There are several basic ways why the genetic fallacy is wrong, why it's mistaken. This can be justified with various kinds of philosophical argument, but only one of these arguments has to be correct for the genetic fallacy to be mistaken. So, for example, the ancient skeptics, as represented by Pyrrho, give us all sorts of basic skeptical arguments which simply point out the uncertainty of all our beliefs. They point out that no claim can be absolutely known to be true or false. We can always ask open question about any given claim that we might make. So if that's the case, whatever you think your absolute source is, that source can't possibly know what's completely right or wrong. A second kind of argument points out that we're finite. So if we're finite, well, that means that we have a limited knowledge. We have a particular point in time and space which limits what we can know and what we can understand. So we don't have the infinite perspective that will be required to be absolutely right. So, again, no finite source can be absolutely right. And of course that's also a problem with the kind of claim that you get in revelatory religious sources, that somehow the infinite, or the authority of the infinite has been somehow given to the finite, that a finite text can be the word of God. Then a third kind of perspective, a third kind of reason why the genetic fallacy is mistaken, is simply to do with the kind of meaning we have. For things to be meaningful to us, they depend on our bodies. And the embodied meaning philosophy of Lakoff, or George Lakoff, or Mark Johnson, shows that because we depend on our bodies for meaning, we can't have a representation of truth in an absolute sense. We have something that's meaningful to us because of our relationship to it. Words just aren't like that. They can't hold absolute authority in that way. So, given that the genetic fallacy is mistaken, appeals to authority are, well, a way to not address conditions. They're closely related to the confirmation bias, which I looked at in the first video of this series, the mistakes we make in thinking. And the problem with appeals to authority is that they're absolutized, so they involve absolutization, represented by the infinity mark, again as in the previous video. Now, you need to distinguish that from credibility judgments. Credibility judgments are just when we recognize, because we've experienced it, that some sources of information are better than others. So yes, I do trust the BBC more than Fox News, for example. I do trust a friend that I know well over a stranger, just because I got more information about how credible they are. So our experience can give us information, incremental information, that is, on a spectrum as to how one source may be better than another, given particularly that we have limited resources and limited time and so on, so we can't research everything, we have to take shortcuts. The fact that we're finite beings means that we do have to rely on credibility to decide what to give our attention to. So credibility is necessary, but we can base our judgments of credibility on experience. And if we absolutize those judgments, if we say, well, this is absolutely right or this is absolutely wrong just because of its source, then we're likely to undermine what that experience tells us. Now, these issues of authority can be traced from the evidence of psychology, from cognitive psychology, and also from the tradition in philosophy of fallacies, particularly informal fallacies. So starting with the psychological background, one famous instance of what's known as the authority bias, the cognitive bias known as the authority bias, was shown by Stanley Milgram in his famous experiments. In these experiments, he was trying to find out what people's responses to authority were and how susceptible they really were to authority. There was an experimenter, which is shown in this diagram as E, and there was a subject marked here as T, that is a person who was a volunteer who joined the experiment, and then there was also a person who was supposed to be a learner, who was marked L here, and this person was actually an actor, but was supposed to be the subject of experiments to investigate how far electrical shocks might improve learning. So the person T, the subject of the experiment, was requested by the authority figure E to give increasingly high electrical shocks to L, the learner. And although in fact L didn't actually receive any electrical shocks, being an actor, L showed more and more signs of distress. But what Milgram found was that people would persist in giving these electrical shocks, supposedly to support learning, given the authoritative figure telling them to give higher and higher electrical shocks, so they would go far beyond the point that one might initially predict before they would generally, on average, start questioning the experimenter or refuse to carry on with the experiment on the grounds of the suffering they were causing to the person at the other end. So that famous experiment revealed a general authority bias in the population. That is, our tendency, when we're off guard at least, to accept authority without further reflection. Obviously this can be related to our genetic situation, that we're in some ways programmed to do this, but also our social conditioning. But beyond that, obviously there's some aspects of authority bias that we can't do anything about, but there are also areas we can work with and be responsible for. And obviously the fact that people vary in their responses to authority bias and their degree of authority bias can show you that people can learn how to lessen that bias. Another aspect of the way in which the appeal to authority appears in psychology is the sleeper effect. And the sleeper effect shows that authority is not limited to a particular time, to the time when an authoritative instruction is given. We may, at the time we hear an authoritative command, reject that command, as in the illustration here. So supposing there's an authority figure, maybe a Hitlerian figure on the radio who's blasting on about immigrants being a threat to our way of life, and somebody hears it and thinks it's nonsense. But then later on, it's been discovered that people can quite often flip, or their repressed acceptance of the authoritative claims being made reappears, and they turn out to have accepted them unconsciously. So that's another aspect of the authority bias that we need to be aware of, because not just that we need to be critical of authority at the moment in the short term, but that perspective needs to be maintained over a longer period of time. In the philosophical tradition of informal fallacies, one aspect of the authority, the appeal to authority, is what's known as ad hominem argument. So ad hominem argument obviously appears at a point where you are engaged in argument or dispute with somebody, and instead of addressing their arguments, you address, well, the man or the woman. The ad hominem means to the man. So, for example, if somebody was to reject someone else's argument on the grounds that they haven't got a PhD, even though what they might have been saying might have had no direct connection with that at all, then that would be an example of ad hominem argument. Ad hominem argument can be used negatively, but it can also be used positively, so you might just accept what somebody's arguing because of who they are, again. So this is another version of the genetic fallacy. Another informal fallacy that's related to this is the tu quoque. Tu quoque means you too, in Latin, and it refers to a tendency for us to reject claims that are hypocritical. So imagine, as in the picture, that there is a distinctly overweight doctor who is giving you medical advice, and he's telling you should lose some weight. Now, of course, you may feel that the doctor's advice is not justified because the doctor himself is overweight, but that will be a kind of reversed negative authority bias. So you are, in effect, judging because of the kind of person, because of who the doctor is. You're not weighing his advice in its own terms, you're directing it at him as an authority. So the tu quoque is not justified, given that it's not the doctor you're judging, it's yourself, and whether you are overweight and whether you need to lose weight, the doctor can still be right, even if he is a hypocrite. And of course that can also work negatively. Just because somebody is especially virtuous, again, doesn't mean that they can't be wrong. I talked earlier about the relationship between credibility and absolutization, and it's important to understand that credibility is actually a justifiable way of working, that we can judge people on grounds of credibility. Indeed we have to, we've got very little choice other than to do that. But the credibility criteria themselves can be used incrementally or absolutized. So although we may make justifiable incremental use of ways of judging people according to how we've experienced them as being, or how others have experienced them as being, we have no excuse for absolutizing those criteria. So here are some examples of credibility criteria that we might use in experience. We might judge somebody to be more reliable or more justifiable because of their expertise, particularly if they're talking about a subject where they've received training and education, or in which they've done a job for a particular length of time. Assuming they're saying something that's relevant to that, then you may well trust them because of their expertise, just as you listen to your doctor when he's giving you medical advice. A second credibility criterion is reputation. So we're more likely to believe somebody if they are believed by others to be reliable, and of course less likely to if they have a bad reputation. The ability to access information can also be, in some circumstances, can be important. So particularly if you imagine somebody has witnessed an accident, well, whether you trust their information does depend very much on whether they're in a good view, whether they're in a good position to view the accident. Some people may have a record of past bias, which might make you suspicious of what they say now, if they've been misleading in the past, so a known liar is less likely to be believed in the future. And vested interests can often contribute to changes in degree of credibility. So obviously a salesman who's trying to sell you something, the claims they make about the product they're selling need to be taken with a pinch of salt because of the vested interest they have in selling you that product. So they will always focus on the positive aspects, they won't tell you about the drawbacks. So obviously you need to look at other sources of information apart from just what the salesman tells you. Then finally, another credibility criterion is corroboration or conflict. So it may be that what you're being told by one person corroborates what you've been told elsewhere, in which case you're more likely to believe them. But if it conflicts, then you may be less likely. So all of these are relative or incremental criteria we can quite justifiably use. The problem is that we can take any one of those and we can turn it into an absolutization. So, for example, you might take a politician who you're listening to, but because that politician wants to be re-elected and wants to impress people, maybe the politician is defending his record, then you might believe that he must be wrong because he's got vested interests. But, of course, that's not necessarily the case. The politician defending his record may be quite correct in what he's asserting about it. You need to look further at whether he's justified in other ways. Or, on the other hand, positively, you might absolutize, supposing there's a young woman who's making claims to you, and you assume she must be right because nobody else seems to doubt her. She seems to have a generally good reputation. Other people seem to believe her. So, credibility criteria can be absolutized. Any of those 6 can be absolutized, negatively or positively. So, how can we avoid appeals to authority? How can we work so as to not fall into these particular kind of mistakes we make in thinking? I want to suggest that there are 4 overlapping ways that we can avoid them. One is attention to the wider sources of information available to us. So, particularly if there's one source of authority, we need to be aware of the alternatives and not just restrict our attention to one. Which is why it's quite a good idea, for example, if you're a Christian, read some atheist books, and if you're an atheist, read some Christian books or whatever. So be aware of what your opponents are arguing and try to engage with it. Secondly, critical awareness about your sources. So simply being aware of the fact that they are limited, they're based on limited information, they're created by fallible human beings. And that, of course, is related to the first point, because if you're aware of other alternative sources of information, they may give you criticisms to consider about the sources you're more inclined to trust. So you don't necessarily just have to reject the sources you've traditionally trusted, but you can be aware that they're not perfect and not absolute. Thirdly, we can incrementalize the credibility criteria. So, for example, if you really feel that a great religious teacher is reliable because they've got this great reputation and there's a whole tradition which says how wonderful they are, well, try and put that on an incremental scale, so that you're not thinking about this person as absolutely correct in everything they assert. But nevertheless, you can appreciate them for their probably very real virtues, that they do have probably deep insights and important things to communicate and offer to people. There's no reason why you should reject that, but at the same time you can do so without absolutizing their position. Yes, you can discuss the faults of Jesus, for example, as you can with any other person. Finally, to separate people from archetypes. So, archetypes are psychological functions that are found around the world in all people, which are quite often projected onto people. For example, the shadow is an example of an archetype which represents what we reject. Satan, for example, or Sauron in Tolkien, or Voldemort, whatever, are examples of the shadow archetype. But if you think that your boss is the evil lord or the dark lord or something like this, you're projecting that archetype onto the boss. A lot of authority problems are associated with either a positive or negative projection of an archetype. And there are 2 particular archetypes that we might mix them up with. So on the one hand, there's the archetype, the God archetype, where a person is a source of infinite wisdom. So if we project that onto a person or onto a text, obviously it's going to be misleading in one respect. On the other hand, we might project the negative archetype, as in Satan, and again believe that the person or the book has the attributes of Satan. But to separate those 2, really we need those blue lines between both the positive and the negative archetypes, and to consider the mixed-upness, the in-the-middleness of both people and texts that are finite. They will have some insights, they will have some understanding, and they will be deficient in other ways. They have credibility, yes, but that credibility is incremental. So if you want an overall message about sources of authority, then it's try and stay in the messy middle. Try not to go too quickly to either to God or the devil, either to the absolute acceptance or the absolute rejection, because that's where a more adequate position is to be found, and that's where you're going to be open to correction, no longer caught up in endless rounds of confirmation bias. So that was the second in the series of mistakes we make in thinking. For more details of all the cognitive mistakes covered in this series and their relationship to the absolutization thesis and the practice of the middle way, see Middle Way Philosophy 4, The Integration of Belief by Robert M Ellis. This is available from Amazon and from Lulu.com. It's available as a paperback book, and it's also available as an ebook within Middle Way Philosophy Omnibus Edition. Also, for a community devoted to working with the mistakes we make in thinking and relating them to other forms of integration, please see the Middle Way Society, their website, www.middlewaysociety.org.